Hi there, I'm Amy, the family chef, and today I'm going to make a black bean, sweet potato, and ground beef chili. It's really delicious, super easy, and it's one of my favorite recipes that I like to make for my family. So to get started, I'm going to saute the vegetables first, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to cut and saute onions. Believe it or not, makes a big difference in the flavor of your chili. What I've done is I've cut the top of the onion and I peeled it back and I've left the core. And when I cook at home, everything is happening in parallel. So while the onions are cooking, I'm cutting something else, and while that's cooking, I'm preparing the next part of the meal. So this is exactly how I cook this dish at home. Medium-high heat, pretty good. And while that is heating, then I cut the onions. So if you can see this, put your hands between the onion here. Make sure you have a sharp knife, come down, make small slits in the onion going one direction. I always have a flat piece of vegetable so it doesn't roll. Again, keep that in to keep it intact. And I find that for myself, this is a great way to cut an onion. I don't need to cut it again going the other direction. And notice I keep my hand there to sort of steady the knife, and once it slides into the onion, I come down. That way, if the onion's a little slippery, I make sure it's in before I go all the way down so it doesn't cut my fingers. We're going to do the claw. This is something I learned in culinary school. And what you're doing is you are holding the vegetable, and then you're using your knuckles as a guide. And I just push that. And again, real quick, I'm going to do the other side. And by the time I have my onion cut, and you're probably looking at me saying, and I'm sorry that I'm crying, you're probably looking at me saying, well, I can't cut that quickly at home. It takes me forever, and you have to practice. And wow, my eyes are tearing. It is pretty funny. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you don't have too much of the core, and if you do, just sort of get rid of that. I'm going to add about a teaspoon, about 2 teaspoons. I really don't do a lot of measuring. The only time I measure is for recipes, but I've measured that and I know how much that is. Now listen to the sound of the onions as they hit the pan. Ooh, wow. That would be my arm. Take a spoon and distribute it. I know it's loud, I'm sorry. And then we're going to take all of our spices, and I'll tell you what's in this in just a moment, and we're going to sprinkle it over the onions. Wow, delicious. And give that a stir. And then we're just going to let it cook, and we're going to do what I like to call stepping away from the stove. I have 6.5 little baby carrots. Put them together. They're not super flat, but I'm going to use that claw and cut, cut, cut. Watch my thumb, use my finger to push it. So one thing I want you to notice as far as the onions that I haven't done, and this drives people crazy in my cooking classes, I have not stirred that at all since we left. But what it does is it makes a great caramelization, great browning. You don't get too much liquid coming out of the vegetables. Delicious. Let me throw this in. What I've done is I've added the carrots, and the most wonderful thing is happening. All those spices that I've added have started to toast. So I added 1 teaspoon of cumin, half a teaspoon each of oregano, coriander, black pepper, and 2 tablespoons of chili powder. And I start with that, and then later when it's cooking, I will taste it again and see if it needs anything else. Usually a little cumin and coriander at a minimum. Sweet potato, I'm using about a half, again, flat surface. Cut it in half again, hold it together. Just think that sweet potato gives it a nice flavor to the chili, something a little sweet. The most important part about a knife to me is that it's sharp and that it's steady. So let me go ahead and add this to the pot. And I might just give it one little stir, and that's about it. I've added the sweet potato, give it another little stir, otherwise I'm going to leave that alone. And the other thing I don't add till closer to the end is garlic. And the reason that I don't add the garlic in the beginning is that if I did and it was sitting there toasting and cooking, it would burn and get brown and very bitter. Oftentimes people say, what's the best way to take the garlic peel off? And some people buy pre-peeled garlic, which may not taste quite as good as fresh garlic. So this is 1 clove. Use the back of my knife, palm up, a couple taps, comes right off. And I like to remove this part. It's the part of the stem. And then same thing, I'm holding it close. I'm doing some slices in one direction, and then I'm going to slice in the other direction. Talk about the spices that are in there, the seasonings. I almost always add my seasonings with my onion, or at least the vegetables, so that they can toast in the pan. I'm going to take them out of the pan, and then I'm going to add the meat. And you may say, well, why are you doing that? Why not add the meat all at once? And if it doesn't have enough room to cook, what happens is it'll start to seam. Have you ever seen gray meat? It's just icky. Even if you're using ground turkey meat, you want to get a nice sear. So the reason that I do that is I cook the veggies first, take them out, and then do the meat separate. And I always make sure, this is really important, I always make sure that there's enough surface area in the pot itself. So I'm making that in a fairly big pot, but if you were making this in a smaller pot, the vegetables are fine, but when you do the browning of the meat, you might say you're just doing a pound of meat, you might have to do that in 2 batches. It makes a huge, huge difference. Next step is to cook the meat. So I put the pan back onto the stove, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the meat to this hot, hot pan. I'm not going to stir it. I'm just going to, you hear that sizzle? Go ahead and zoom right in there. If you have very lean meat, you can add some olive oil, especially if you're using ground turkey. This meat has a fair amount of fat. It is a natural grass-fed meat that I was able to get locally, which I love. It's really tasty. And because I have this nice big pot, I will not have to do this in 2 batches. Remember earlier I said if you had a smaller pot, you'd have to do it in 2 batches. And I'm just going to now step away from the stove. Cook the meat, and I turn it over. I want you to come over and take a look at it. Look at that nice browning on the meat, and notice how the pieces are pretty big. It's almost like they're little hamburgers. And what we're doing is we cooked on the one side and turn it over. We're cooking it on the other side, and then I'm going to take the spoon and just sort of chop it up. It's all the way cooked. I've broken it up with a spoon, and if you see, it's got some big pieces, but I sort of like that. We have here about 1.5 cups of black beans, the cooked carrots, onions, sweet potatoes. That's all going to go in. Some diced tomatoes, and some tomato sauce. And then what I'm going to do is to fill these with water. Each can sort of rinses out the can itself and then creates a little broth. So I'm going to let that come up to a simmer, and then I'm going to cook it for maybe about 20 minutes, and dinner's ready. So let's check it when it's done. Back with my black bean chili. Let's come take a look. Remember, it has sweet potatoes, black beans, ground beef. And what I had done was I had added some water, and I added the tomatoes and so forth. And one thing I forgot to tell you that I added was some tomato paste. And a little trick that I have is I open a little can of tomato paste, and I use what I need, and then I put that into a plastic bag into the freezer, and then I sort of separate it out, pushing a little to the edge, and I just use about a tablespoon. I also added 1 teaspoon of salt, and I tasted it earlier and it tasted a little spicy to me, so I added 1/2 teaspoon of sugar. So that's a little trick, is if it's a little spicy, add some sugar to balance it out. If you don't want to add the sugar, you can try sour cream or plain yogurt while you're eating it, because sometimes I know with children they don't like things too spicy. Final test. And this is just a nice, easy, look at that nice bite. A nice, easy meal that you can make any night of the week. You could always have your onions and your carrots and sweet potatoes cut up. I'm afraid I'm going to burn my mouth, but I'm going to just take a little sip. Mmm, so delicious. You can serve it over polenta, you can serve it over rice, over baked potatoes, and top it with sour cream or cheese, or leave it plain. So I hope you like this recipe. You can find more at thefamilychef.blogspot.com, and I hope you like the video. Thank you.